It was 1908, and mankind was on the verge of marvelous things. Powered flight was a reality, but the world was still trying to come to grips with its potential. And in Berkeley, California, the limits of power flight were being tested, with the magnificent Morrell Airship about to redefine the public's perception of aviation. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
John A. Morrell was a man with a vision. To that end, in 1905, an advertisement wrote, several members of the International Aero Club incorporated the National Airship Company for the purpose of aiding the progress of civilization and enriching whoever would invest in the stock. In a 1907 prospectus for the company, Morrell made his case for investing in his idea for an airship called the Ariel. The San Francisco Examiner explained in October of that year. Morrell proposed to put in commission an airship which will be capable of carrying 500 passengers and 40 tons of mail from New York to London in a 24-hour trip. The website Then and Now writes, the prospectus called for landing docks on the tops of office buildings in all the large cities of the world and stated that his airships would earn over $25,000 a day.
It was an ambitious plan. The Ariel was to be 1,250 feet long. In Germany, Count von Hindenburg's largest airship, the L-3, was just 414 feet. In fact, the Ariel was to be about a third longer than the Hindenburg, which wouldn't be built for another 28 years.
But Morrell believed that he had identified the secret: hollow aluminum tubes. Worldwide Magazine wrote in 1908, the chairs in this remarkable craft would be made of hollow aluminum tubes and weigh only 17 ounces. The bedsteads of the same material weighing 27 ounces. The ship, the magazine writes, was intended to make regular trips between San Francisco and New York City, carrying passengers as comfortably as a Pullman car. As the Ariel was supposedly under construction, Morrell produced an experimental craft intended to bolster faith in the company for which he was seeking funds. Built in San Francisco, the experimental ship was a marvel in itself. 630 feet long and 36 feet in diameter, it was possibly the largest airship ever built to that time, certainly the largest ever built in the United States. In preparation for a test flight on October 1st, the San Francisco Examiner writes, Mr. Morrell had fitted the huge balloon with gas, converting it from a flapping bag of helpless canvas into a struggling gigantic thing of titanic strength. But things don't always go as planned when you're on the cutting edge of technology. The Examiner goes on. Mr. Morrell has long and eagerly awaited a trial trip with his airship. Yesterday, with his crew of 10 men, he filled the vessel with gas and allowed it, after ballasting with over 5,000 pounds in brick and sand, to rise to a height of about 300 feet, securely anchored by 1.5-inch ropes at the bow and stern. Slackening on the bow rope to right it, the enormous bag thus released at one end jumped suddenly upward and snapped the stern anchor rope, pulling away from the snub rope at the bow. Then it shot upward. Morrell's gas bag was suddenly loose. The Stockton, California Evening Mail reported, in the city, crowds obstructed the street corners, viewing with amusement or horror the masterless aerial vessel. Reports came that there were men on board, that the huge ship had become unmanageable, that the fearless sailors were doomed to a horrible death, but no one was on it. The Examiner described the adventure. The powerful monster careened and tossed its upward flight, seemingly striving for mastery with the rushing air currents. In the grasp of the wind, it struggled for supremacy, and then, vanquished, was carried across the heavens. The spectacle drew quite the crowd. The Examiner continued, every house added its quota to the pursuing crowd, all eager to be in at the death. At Redwood, fresh cohorts took the trail and, heartened by the evident exhausted state of the runaway airship, pressed on with intense enthusiasm. Walking, running, in automobiles, carriages of all description, astride a horse or bicycle, the unique army sped on. But the adventure couldn't last. Fair Oaks witnessed the end. Getting too near the oaks there, the immense bag was caught by a dozen branches. It swelled against them, becoming still more entangled, and then, in the struggle for freedom, tore in a score of places, collapsing like a dish rag.
What was left was mostly, according to the Examiner, carried away by the following crowds as souvenirs. You might think that Mr. Morrell would be disheartened that his first balloon wound up as a dish rag, but according to the Examiner, he was not discouraged. Why, I feel badly when I think of the setback that we received, he told an Examiner reporter. I cannot but be elated at the way that the ship behaved. She has proven that she was built on solid plans. While the only thought of all of us as she floated away was, if only we were on board.
Undeterred, Morrell continued to market his company. A January 7th edition of the Los Angeles Evening Post-Record writes that Morrell confidently declares that it is the airship, and not the corporation, that will go up. The newspaper continues. The balloon is shaped like a huge projectile made to split the air at a 2.5 miles a minute clip. The inventor, in all confidence, declares that aerial navigation is solved, and that before the middle of next year he will be dispensing tickets for airship tours from San Francisco to New York. Apparently, Morrell's company had found success, as the Evening Post-Record notes. Up to last June, 183,339 shares had been sold. It's not surprising, given the adventure in October, that San Francisco was not as confident as Mr. Morrell. San Francisco Fire Chief Patrick Shaughnessy refused to allow a permit to test the bag, which would be filled with flammable natural gas from the municipal system. Undaunted, Morrell moved the test to Berkeley. There, the Oakland Tribune noted, Fire Chief James Kinney was opposed to permitting the ascent for fear that, in falling, the machine might crash into a house or, by an explosion, start a serious conflagration. But he told the newspaper, I did not want to interfere as long as no formal complaints were made. Chief Shaughnessy told me that he had refused to permit the test of such a machine in San Francisco. But had I interfered, somebody here would have raised a protest and charged that I was seeking to interfere with a legitimate enterprise. For his part, Morrell was disappointed at San Francisco's lack of vision. He told the Berkeley Gazette, if San Francisco had accorded me the treatment I've received in Berkeley, successful aerial navigation would have been a reality a year ago, instead of a probability that is doubted by many at the present time. Of the work in Berkeley, the Gazette wrote on May 6th, the Morrell Airship Company is constructing a monster airship in the city, the progress of which will be watched with interest. A lot back of the high school building and extending from Millville Street to Grove has been selected as the site of the enormous vessel that will be constructed to soar the dizzy heights. About 50 men are working like nailers to complete the craft, and the busiest man in the force is J.A. Morrell, inventor of the ship. He is here, there, and everywhere on the job, watching to see that his instructions are carried out in the minutest detail.
The airship was of a type that would come to be called semi-rigid. The gas bag had no internal structure, but the entire long balloon had a strong keel that was made of woven hemp.
The craft was described in the Oakland Tribune. The ship is a huge cylindrical affair, 450 feet long with a diameter of 36 feet. When filled with gas, it will have a lifting capacity of 14 tons, while the dead weight of the engines, canvas bag, and men to operate it will not exceed to 5 tons. Morrell says that his ship is a combination of an aeroplane and a gas balloon. Below the huge canvas filled with gas will be a keel upon which will be mounted 5 60-horsepower automobile gasoline engines. These engines will be 60 feet apart, and each will operate a propeller and combination aeroplane. In this manner, the big car can be driven at will, with the man directing the flight from a steering gear in the rear. There will be an engineer for each engine ensconced in the seat directly behind. And the speed of the aeroplane or propellers will thus be under the control of the engineers, who will act on signals from the director of the flight. The flight would carry 15 people, including spaces for photographers and invited guests. The number was described as by far the most to have ever ridden a balloon at the time. On May 18th, the Gazette wrote, everyone is anxiously awaiting the trial of the Morrell Airship, which is being constructed in the lot on Kittredge Street between Milva and Grove Street. This is one of the largest airships in the world, being over 400 feet in length, and has been built along entirely different lines than any former experiment.
But there was reason to be concerned, and not just because of the fiasco from the previous October.
The Gazette noted, there is a diversion of opinion as to the safety of the craft. The builder, J.A. Morrell, having every confidence in his invention, while Colonel F.A. Postnikoff of 1828 Delaware Street questions the quality of the material used to confine the gas in the enormous bag. The colonel was no idle speculator. The Gazette explains, Colonel Postnikoff is an expert in aerial craft. He was an officer in the Russian army during the Russo-Japanese War and was in charge of the Tsar's war balloons at Vladivostok. He told the paper, I am very much interested in the construction of the big ship that is being built in the city and have made a careful examination of it. I believe that the builder, Mr. Morrell, is a deep thinker and a first-class machinist, but it requires more than a knowledge of mechanics to build any kind of an aerial craft successfully. One must be familiar with the physics as well, and I am anxious that nothing in my remarks shall be construed to discourage anyone who is trying to solve the question of aerial navigation. But as a student of these things, I feel that the ship Mr. Morrell is building is unsafe. Morrell, for his part, was confident as ever. I came to Berkeley to build my ship for trial purposes, to train my crew and demonstrate to the world that my theory is right, he told the Gazette. All that I ask at the present time is for the interested ones, as well as those who are doubtful, to wait and see for themselves."
And both the doubtful and the interested would have a chance to see if he was right on May 23rd, 1908, 114 years ago today.
The interested were many. The Examiner wrote, "For 3 days, the region about Kittredge and Grove Street, where the airship was being prepared and made ready for the flight, has been haunted by curious people. Late Friday night, it was announced on the streets the Morrell would essay an ascension yesterday morning, and people were assembled as early as 3 in the morning. It was 6 hours later when Morrell made the definite statement that a flight would be made, and thousands had gathered by that time. When the great bag began to fill with gas pumped from a nearby main, the excitement of the spectators was keen. The crowd increased until a few minutes before the start, the streets were blocked for 3 squares away." The Oakland Tribune described the launch. "There was a preliminary test of the engines, and Morrell dropped his hat from his seat to straddle the hempen keel near the front of the ship, and the signal to start. The signal was apparently misunderstood, and one of the anchormen tipped the airship forward. It was when the most elevated part of the airship had risen about 300 feet that the first warning of disaster was received. The middle of the gas holder was seen to wrinkle, thus interfering with the even flow of the gas. Aeronaut Ben Taylor, who had been denied a spot by Morrell but stowed away last minute, taking the total number aboard to 16, told the Tribune, "The ascension was a good one, but soon after we were up on one end. The bag began to tip. I looked at Morrell and saw him make his way through the machinery toward the higher end. He cried, 'This way, boys!' His idea was to weigh down that end and thus allow us to go down evenly. At that time, the machine was going down with a rush. I tried to follow him, but before I knew it, the machine hit the ground." The Chicago Tribune wrote, 300 feet above a crowd of 10,000 persons, gay one moment, dumb with horror the next, and screaming in panic, the huge Morrell airship, the largest in the world, tipped, split, and burst, tumbling like a bullet-stricken bird and dashing its human freight to agony and injury against the earth. The Oakland Tribune wrote, "In one immense mass, the great balloon and its attendants fell, covering a space almost equal to a city block, and pinioning beneath the wreckage the men who had undertaken to make the flight. Some were almost smothered by the escaping gas, while others suffered broken limbs and internal injuries of a serious nature." And the risk was not just to the aeronauts caught in the wreckage. The Oakland Tribune lamented, "There was a horrifying medley of shouts and shrieks from the thousands of people clustered about. For a moment it seemed the ship and its weight of engines, men, and torn canvas would fall directly into the mass of women and children that crowded every available inch of space about the corner of Milva and Kittredge streets. The air was full of cries of terror. Men began to fight for space to move, and women fainted." Finally, the once great vessel for which Mr. Morrell had such high hopes was again the victim of the mob. The Oakland Tribune writes, "After the wounded had been removed and the crowd had recovered from the horror, there was a rush of souvenir hunters, and all sorts of vandalism was committed." By May 25th, the Berkeley Gazette wrote, "A few pieces of scrap iron and remnants of canvas are all that remains of the monster Morrell airship, which had been such an object of interest to scores of visitors at Kittredge, Milva, and Grove Streets for the last month, and the initial flight of which, on Saturday, proved so disastrous."
And yet, almost miraculously, what has been described as America's first dirigible disaster didn't kill a single person, although all 16 men on board suffered injuries of varying severity. Morrell himself suffered a broken leg.
The failure should not have been a surprise. Aeronautics magazine noted in June that the company had been under investigation since March. Referring to his claims on the company prospectus, they called Morrell the world's most prolific liar. Worldwide magazine said of the balloon design, nearly every well-known principle of airship construction was violated. Alexander Graham Bell declared that the balloon should have used ballast for a test rather than risking so many people. By May 25th, the Berkeley Gazette was reporting that Morrell was being sued by stockholders, the largest of which was suspected to be his girlfriend.
History is full of those stories of those who persevered, even when those around him were telling them that they were overly optimistic, perhaps downright crazy. And we love to tell the stories of those who beat the odds, proved the naysayers wrong, saw a future that others could not. History, ironically, doesn't seem to remember nearly as well those times when it was the naysayers who got it right. But perhaps Mr. Morrell was, in fact, a visionary ahead of his time. I mean, after all, the crash of the magnificent Morrell airship beat the Hindenburg by nearly 3 decades. Oh, the humanity. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.